final case study that Jeff outlined. I'm going to use a number of terms but to describe, but basically we'll be talking about AI-enabled ambient scribing. So sometimes I'll call that AI scribe, sometimes I'll call it AVTs. It's probably also worth saying at the beginning that also the principles that I talk about here will apply to other types of AI that summarize healthcare data, such as AI discharge tools. So it's not just completely that these principles in relation to this IG case study are relevant to AI-enabled ambient scribing. Next slide, please. So I think the catalyst for this is, oh, sorry, the one before. I was just going to do some introduction first, thank you. So we know that there's significant evidence, and Jeff talked about that, relating to the benefits of using AI scribes in clinical care, the fact that these reduce clinician time and enhance patient experience, with clinicians being able to give more focus to their patients. And clinicians have been leading the way in adopting this technology, and we know that the system has actually been behind clinicians in providing the advice and guidance that they need to be able to use these devices in their practice. And particularly we know that IG guidance is really lacking here, and as we go through, I'll explain part of the reason why that's the case. So my hope is to give some clarity on what's currently a very uncertain legal and governance framework, but particularly I'm going to give some information about what the forthcoming information governance guidance, which will be published on the NHS England Information Governance Portal, will say. One thing that I think we can say, and this may not be news to anyone, that it's important for many regulatory reasons to only adopt AI scribe tools which are adopted and approved by your organisation, and avoid any kind of direct commissioning of AI scribes, because that may mean that it may risk non-compliance with legal and information governance frameworks, and liability is likely to sit with individual users in those circumstances. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there was a big ministerial push to provide guidance on NHS England, to provide guidance to the sector on AI scribes, both general guidance relating to clinical safety, of which I'm not an expert at all, and then on top of that, where my expertise sits, to provide IG guidance to the system based on NHS England's general guidance on AI scribes. So the first of these, the general guidance on AI scribes, was published in April this year. And on the back of that, we started to draft the IG guidance. However, shortly after the central guidance was published, there was a letter which you may have seen from the Chief Clinical Information Officer to the system, warning on the use of the kind of non-compliant use of AI scribes, and around this idea of direct commissioning of AI scribes. And some of what was in that letter meant that we had to go back and review the work in the IG guidance to ensure consistency across all of the guidance. Next slide, please. So as we've been drafting the IG guidance, there's been a lot of issues that has been difficult to ensure consistency on across a number of stakeholder organisations. I'm going to boil it down to three here that I think are the most important, but that they are not by any means the only areas where there is a kind of lack of clarity. But I will talk about the common law legal basis, so not focusing here on GDPR, transparency, and issues around data retention and deletion. So in relation to what is the common law legal basis for collecting data in AI scribes, well, it really depends on the purpose for which that technology is being used. So where that is being used in individual care, the consensus is that clinicians can rely on implied consent for direct care when they're using that technology to collect information for care. This is a separate point from transparency. And what we've been clear about, this doesn't mean you don't need to be transparent about these technologies. It's just that the legal basis that you're relying on for the collection of data is not explicit consent, it's implied consent. This is different if the tool is used to collect data, if it's used to collect data for care that is then used for research. If the data is then used for research purposes, then at that point there should be consent, explicit consent for the research purposes, because you would have that person in front of you in the clinical setting. So any use of that data for research should be consented at that point, rather than relying on an alternative legal gateway. And then the one that's the most problematic, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about data retention and deletion, is the post-market surveillance and service evaluation. This relates back to what Jeff was saying, particularly in relation to whether or not the AI technology that you're using is a medical device. And we know that for AI scribes, there's been a lot of discussion about that, but it will be a medical device. And this is particularly problematic because the law in this space is not clear at all. I think it depends very much on the classification of the activity, and if you can deem what is the activity as being some sort of local clinical audit or local service evaluation, it may be that that data can be processed for that purposes under the legal basis of implied consent for direct care. But where this happens on a more regional or national level, it currently is very unclear what the legal basis would be. And this is really going to be quite problematic. On this, I will say, I think you might get a link later today from UK Council of Caldicott Guardians. It comes from the NHS England IG portal. They are creating a roadmap of AI guidance, which the system requires, and they are seeking to gain views from the system to determine what guidance is needed is the biggest priority, and that hopefully will come out. And there's around 5 or 6 different AI types of guidance on there, including AI to support for supportive purposes and non-clinical purposes. So it'd be great if you could give some feedback to NHS England IG team on what they need to prioritise in terms of the guidance that they're producing in the AI guidance roadmap. Next slide, please.
Probably to wind up in the next couple of minutes, please, Vicky.
Right, I'll be super quick. So transparency. So the difference between informed consent, seeking informed consent, and notifying people. Whilst we're clear that informed consent's not the legal basis, it's key that where there's a novel technology like this, that people should be informed through when they're sitting in front of you. So it's verbally, and we've put something into the guidance. We've put some template wording in there for explaining this to people, but through privacy notices. But also there should be transparency for clinicians as well as patients, in terms of it should be clear that outputs have been created by AI. And next slide, please. And lastly, on data retention and deletion, this was really problematic in the guidance. Again, it depends on the reason you're collecting the data. So for individual care, the information, there was disagreement whether there should be automatic deletion or whether the information should be deleted once it had been reviewed by a clinician and signed off. In the guidance, we've settled on the latter, that it needs to be signed off by the clinician and embedded into the clinical record before it's deleted from the AI technology. Post-market surveillance, again, incredibly problematic, partly because we have the medical devices post-market surveillance requirements. So there is a regulatory requirement to ensure that you have a post-market surveillance system, which includes the analysis of data for the quality, performance and safety. This is incredibly problematic because, as I set out before, it's not clear what the legal basis for retaining the data for that activity is. And this is something that guidance needs to tackle in the future. With research, generally, the data deletion and retention should be in line with the research protocol, and that should be clear to the patient in the consent process. And then lastly, outputs that are kept. So that could be something put into the clinical record, like the AI scribe has generated a letter to the patient, a referral letter or a summary. Obviously, where they're incorporated into the clinical record, then the Records Management Code of Practice would cover the retention of the output, and for research, outputs would be in line with the research protocol. So just to finish off, a significant uncertainty. NHS England does have a guidance roadmap, and you can feed into what the priorities for that AI guidance roadmap are through the survey that I think Nisha will share, yes, at some point. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much